It was on a rain-swept afternoon in late November of 1893 that I found myself once more seated in the well-worn armchair opposite Sherlock Holmes in our lodgings at Baker Street. The fire crackled with a steady defiance against the damp gloom that pressed against the windows, and Holmes, wrapped in his Inverness cape, was peering through the latest edition of the Times, his pipe sending up slow, meditative wisps of smoke. I had only just returned from a routine visit to one of my old army colleagues now convalescing at Netley, and I confess the shift from military anecdotes to Holmes's icy silence was almost jarring. Yet, as always, it was only a matter of time before some curious case arrived to break the monotony. That time came sooner than expected. A knock, sharp, urgent, and decidedly out of rhythm, sounded at the door below, followed moments later by the hasty footsteps of Mrs. Hudson ascending the stairs. "A gentleman to see Mr. Holmes," she announced. "Quite pale he is, and damp as a fishmonger's apron." "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said without even looking up. "He has come by cab from the city, and wears gloves he has removed and replaced at least thrice en route." When the door opened, our visitor did indeed appear to match Holmes's deductions. He was a tall, angular man of perhaps 50, with greying temples and a librarian stoop. His clothes, while of fine quality, were dishevelled, his overcoat spotted with rain, his collar slightly askew, and his left glove held crushed in one hand. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked, with a voice that quivered on the edge of civility and desperation. "My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my friend and chronicler, Dr. Watson. Please, do sit down." The man did so, sinking into the armchair as though it were the only solid thing left in his world. He produced a handkerchief and dabbed his forehead. "My name is Percival Armitage. I'm Chief Archivist of the Royal Historical Records Office in Clerkenwell. I come to you, sir, because one of my staff, Mr. Quentin Hollander, has vanished under circumstances most alarming." Holmes's eyes flicked toward me briefly. "Vanished, you say? London is full of men who vanish, usually to parts less savoury than their wives would care to admit. What distinguishes Mr. Hollander's absence?" Armitage took a breath, evidently gathering his thoughts. "Mr. Hollander was no ordinary clerk. He had recently been placed in charge of a highly sensitive collection, a sealed cache of documents pertaining to a series of parliamentary negotiations in 1852. Most of it is still under embargo. Government eyes, you understand." Holmes's interest piqued tangibly. He leaned forward slightly. "And when did this disappearance occur?" 2 days ago, on the evening of the 26th. He had been working late, entirely by his own volition. The building was nearly empty by 6, save for the night porter and 2 clerks finishing inventory. Hollander was seen entering the main archive chamber at 6:05. And then he was gone. Holmes tapped his fingers together, his gaze sharpening. "Gone? Was the building searched?" "Thoroughly, top to bottom. There are only 2 ways out. The front entrance, which is watched by the porter, and a delivery stair at the rear, which was locked from the inside. No one saw him leave. Nobody. No trace. The only thing found was a single glove, his right, lying on the parquet floor of the manuscript wing." I frowned. "And no signs of a struggle?" "None, Doctor Watson. No broken glass, no overturned chairs, nothing disturbed, save the glove. And, well, one peculiar thing. The electric lamp in the manuscript wing had burned out. When we found it, the room was plunged into darkness." Holmes rose and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. "You mentioned the documents were under embargo. Are you suggesting a matter of espionage?" "I cannot say, Mr. Holmes, but I will tell you this. 3 days prior to Hollander's disappearance, he requested access to the sealed portfolios. He claimed to be cross-referencing metadata from the donor files. He signed the ledger as required and received the keys from my assistant, Miss Eliza Barnum. We thought nothing of it. Until now." Holmes stopped pacing. And the police. Inspector Lascombe of Bow Street has taken charge. He's a diligent man, but sees in this nothing more than a case of overwork and voluntary flight. He believes Hollander may have taken the documents and disappeared to sell them abroad. But I know Hollander. He was shy, bookish, utterly devoted to his profession. The kind of man who corrects punctuation in internal memos. He would not, could not, commit treason. Holmes turned to me and raised an eyebrow. A man disappears from a sealed building with no exit, no witnesses, and no apparent motive. Curious, is it not, Watson? Indeed, I said. It has the touch of the impossible. Exactly, Holmes murmured, retrieving his violin from its case. He plucked a single string, letting the note hum through the room. Mr. Armitage, you may rest assured I shall look into the matter. Watson, if you would be so kind, we'll visit Clerkenwell first thing in the morning. But Holmes, I said, surely you cannot expect to find any new evidence after 2 days. My dear Watson, Holmes replied with a smile that barely lifted the corners of his mouth. Evidence is rarely a matter of time. It is a matter of observation. As Armitage left, visibly relieved, the rain resumed its tapping at the panes, as though the storm outside approved of the mystery now unfurling in our firelit sitting room. Holmes returned to his chair and resumed playing a slow, deliberate series of notes. Then, without looking up, he said, "A vanishing archivist. Burned-out lamp. A single glove. It's beginning to sound like a well-composed lie, Watson. But the truth, as ever, must be teased out like a thread from a tapestry." And so began our investigation into the enigma of Quentin Hollander's disappearance, an affair which would lead us down shadowed corridors of bureaucracy, betrayal, and something far older than either of us expected. The following morning dawned with a crisp chill clinging to the edges of the grey London skyline. The streets, slick with the remnants of the previous night's rain, glistened under a sky the colour of tarnished pewter. Fog still lingered like a half-forgotten whisper between the rooftops, and the horses' hooves splashed noisily through shallow puddles as Holmes and I rode by hansom cab toward Clerkenwell. Holmes had been uncharacteristically quiet during our journey. His sharp features were partially obscured by the turned-up collar of his coat, and his eyes, half closed, seemed not to register the bustle of early morning traffic. Only the subtle drumming of his fingers on his cane betrayed the fierce mental activity I knew was simmering beneath the surface. "Percival Armitage," Holmes murmured suddenly, his voice low, "is either gravely mistaken in his assessment of Quentin Hollander's character, or he is concealing something." "You suspect him already?" I asked, slightly surprised. Holmes shook his head. "Not suspect. Observe. His clothing bespoke some measure of wealth, but his cufflinks did not match. The left one was gilt, the right one was silver. That's not mere forgetfulness. It suggests a certain carelessness or perhaps haste. And did you notice the ink stain on his thumb? Fresh, but there was none on his sleeve or collar. He's been tampering with documents recently, yet claims all records were sealed and untouched. Curious. Perhaps he was merely reviewing related files. Perhaps. Or perhaps he has opened something best left closed." The cab drew to a halt before a handsome stone building on Middleton Street, a structure of considerable age, its arched entrance guarded by a pair of wrought iron gates and the sombre hush one associates with public record offices. We stepped out and were met by a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, plainly dressed in a navy skirt and matching coat, her dark hair pinned back with the severe precision of a school mistress. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I'm Eliza Barnum, assistant to Mr. Armitage," she said briskly. "He's asked me to escort you directly to the manuscript wing." Holmes offered a slight bow. "Delighted, Miss Barnum. And might I say, your punctuality does you credit. A rare trait." Her brow twitched slightly, perhaps uncertain whether to take it as compliment or critique. The interior of the building was an austere labyrinth of corridors and tiled floors, its silence broken only by the occasional echo of footsteps or the distant clang of a filing cabinet drawer. Miss Barnum led us through a series of stone-arched halls and up a short staircase before halting before a thick oak door. "This is the main archive chamber," she said. "Hollander was last seen entering here. I was among the last to leave that evening, and I can confirm I saw him go inside shortly after 6. "Did he appear anxious? Distracted?" Holmes inquired. She considered. "No more than usual. He was always a solitary man, soft-spoken, preferred dusk to daylight. But nothing seemed amiss." Holmes removed a small magnifying lens from his coat and crouched by the handle of the heavy door, inspecting the lock and surrounding woodwork. "Not forced. Not tampered with. When was it last used before that evening?" "I unlocked it myself that morning. Routine entry." Holmes nodded, then motioned us forward. Inside, the chamber exhaled a peculiar scent, a mingling of must, paper, and something faintly metallic. The walls were lined with tall oak shelves, each labeled in meticulous calligraphy. A reading desk stood near the center, flanked by 2 shaded gas lamps, one of which was charred, the globe blackened where flame had burst too violently. "Curious," Holmes murmured, tapping the scorched glass. "Has this been replaced since the incident?" "No," Miss Barnum said. "The porter intended to change it the following day, but then, well, everything changed." Holmes examined the desk. A single chair, an open volume of Hansard transcripts from 1851, a blotter with a dried smear, a half-used stick of sealing wax. No sign of recent agitation. And then he paused. On the floor, just beneath the edge of the reading table, lay a thin sliver of wax. Navy blue, tinged faintly with silver specks. Holmes bent, extracted it with tweezers, and placed it in a small envelope. "This was not from the sealing stick here. Different composition entirely." He rose, moving to the far wall where a narrow alcove led to the sealed portfolio cabinets. Here, metal cases were arranged in tidy rows, each locked with its own brass mechanism. "Did Hollander access these?" "Yes." He signed the entry log. I handed him the key. Holmes inspected the log book. His eyes narrowed. "This entry, signed Q. Hollander, is dated the 23rd, but the ink differs from the entries immediately before and after. This is not the same pen, nor the same hand." Miss Barnum looked startled. "But it's his signature. I've seen it dozens of times." Holmes made no reply, but moved quickly to the end of the corridor, where a narrow spiral stair descended toward the basement. "The delivery stair," he said. "Locked, I presume?" "Yes, and the porter keeps the key." "Let us visit him." We descended and crossed into a modest anteroom where the night porter, Mr. Hamley, awaited us. A stout man with a weathered complexion and thick white eyebrows? He rose with a deferential nod. "Morning, gentlemen. Miss Barnum, I understand you're here about the poor missing lad." Holmes gave him a searching look. "Indeed. Mr. Hamley, you were on duty the evening of the 26th. "Aye, sir. From 6 until midnight. Standard hours." "Did anyone leave the building between 6 and the end of your shift?" "No one. Not a soul. The last to exit was Mr. Pritchard, one of the senior clerks, just before 6. After that, it was just Hollander, Miss Barnum, and me. I saw her leave at past. Holmes steepled his fingers. "And Hollander?" "Never saw him come out, sir." "And the delivery stair?" "Locked tight. Here's the key." He removed it from his vest pocket, a long iron specimen with a numbered tag. Holmes took it and examined the wards. "Has this ever left your possession?" "Not in the last fortnight, sir." We returned to the spiral stair and Holmes unlocked the door. It opened with a squeal, revealing a narrow corridor lined with crates and a single coal chute. The door at the far end was bolted from the inside. "No tampering," Holmes muttered. "Either Hollander vanished into thin air, or someone has staged his disappearance with a degree of cleverness I must admire." Watson frowned. But where could he have gone? The building was locked. No exit, no witness. Holmes turned, a shadow of a smile tugging at his lips. That, my dear Watson, is precisely what makes this case interesting. As we re-emerged into the hallway, Holmes paused before a low-mounted wall sconce that seemed oddly crooked. He adjusted it with one finger, revealing a smear of soot beneath, thin and fresh. "Miss Barnum," he said, his voice now cool and formal. "Who else had access to the manuscript wing that evening?" "Only myself, Mr. Armitage, and Mr. Hollander." Holmes gave her a long look. "Indeed. Then I suggest, Watson, we speak with Mr. Armitage once more. I have a few questions regarding the classification of restricted documents and the precise nature of those embargoed portfolios." And without another word, he led us down the corridor, his footsteps sharp and purposeful, leaving behind the silent shelves that seemed to hold more secrets than pages. We found Mr. Percival Armitage seated behind a broad walnut desk in his office on the second floor of the records office. A solemn chamber paneled in dark wood, lit dimly by two gas sconces and the reluctant light filtering through a leaded glass window. The scent of oiled leather and fading paper pervaded the room. His expression brightened somewhat as we entered, though I sensed it was a carefully composed mask. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted us, gesturing to a pair of chairs. "Miss Barnum informed me of your arrival. I trust the examination of the archives proved informative." "In part," Holmes replied coolly as he took his seat, "but rather more suggestive than conclusive, which is often the nature of initial observations. It is the peculiar absences, Mr. Armitage, that I find most telling." Armitage blinked. "Absences?" "The absence of soot upon Mr. Hollander's glove, which suggests he did not handle the faulty gas lamp. The absence of witnesses to his departure. And most curiously, the absence of any rational explanation for how a man might vanish from a locked room without disturbing a single book or paper." The archivist offered a wan smile. "It is precisely why we sought your aid." Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "I must ask now, in precise terms, what exactly was contained in the portfolios to which Mr. Hollander had access? You described them as embargoed parliamentary negotiations. Elaborate, please." Armitage hesitated, then drew a breath. "Yes, the documents pertain to the Anglo-Belgian Canal Commission of 1852. A series of back-channel correspondences between several members of Parliament, mercantile representatives, and Belgian industrialists. They were sealed under official request due to their politically sensitive nature. Potential allegations of bribery, the sort of thing that, even now, might tarnish a few surnames clinging to respectability." "And were all the portfolios still in place after Mr. Hollander's disappearance?" Armitage's lips thinned. "To the best of our inspection, yes." Nothing appeared disturbed. "To the best of your inspection" is a phrase that invites ambiguity. Might I review the inventory lists? Preferably both the master log and the sub-register maintained by Hollander himself. "Of course," Armitage replied, rising and unlocking a tall filing cabinet behind his desk. He extracted two leather-bound ledgers and placed them gently before Holmes. Holmes turned pages swiftly, his long fingers dancing through entries in a manner almost musical. I watched as his brow furrowed, eyes narrowing at irregular intervals. "Watson," he said after several minutes, tapping a page with his index finger. "Here is an anomaly. A packet logged as 16B. Oath correspondence. Confidential appears in the master ledger, but not in Hollander's register." Armitage leaned over to look. That packet was sealed long before Hollander's tenure. It may have been reclassified, perhaps even withdrawn by government order." "Then I presume you have a record of such withdrawal?" Armitage flushed faintly. "I shall have to check our requisitions book." Holmes said nothing, but the silence itself was weighty. He closed the registers and turned to face Armitage fully. "One more point, Mr. Armitage. You have worked with Mr. Hollander for how long? Nearly 7 years. He began as a junior copyist and rose quickly, methodical to a fault. Would you describe him as discreet? Absolutely. He kept his opinions to himself, rarely joined in conversation beyond the professional. And yet, Holmes said slowly, you mentioned yesterday that he was entirely by his own volition, working late on the night of his disappearance. Does that not strike you as odd? Armitage hesitated. I suppose it does. We maintain regular hours, but Mr. Hollander often found solace in his work. He sometimes stayed behind to finish cataloguing. Holmes's eyes glinted. Solace in work or opportunity in isolation? Armitage stiffened. You imply some deception, Mr. Holmes? I imply nothing. I observe. That is all. Holmes rose abruptly. Thank you for your time, Mr. Armitage. I believe our next conversation will require a third participant, someone who may be under the impression that their role has gone unnoticed. He swept out of the office, and I followed in silence, unsure whether Holmes meant Miss Barnum, the porter, or some as yet unseen player in this intellectual game of smoke and keys. As we exited into the corridor, Holmes paused beside a tall grandfather clock and pulled out the small envelope containing the wax fragment retrieved from the archive floor. Watson, he said, do you recall the blotter we saw on Hollander's desk? Yes, there was a smudge, horizontal, uneven. Exactly, as though a sealed envelope had been slid or rotated across it hastily, before the wax had time to harden. This fragment, I believe, is not from standard government seal sticks. It contains flecks of silver, a composite sometimes used by foreign offices to identify diplomatic pouches. You suspect espionage? I suspect misdirection. Hollander may have been lured by something or someone within the office who had far more interest in those documents than mere curiosity. We returned to Baker Street that afternoon, Holmes unusually silent throughout the cab ride. Once home, he moved immediately to his chemistry bench and began to heat the wax fragment over a small burner, his gaze hawkish. Silver dust, he muttered. Yes, and cedar oil, used as a plasticizer in foreign sealing compounds. I watched in fascination as he recorded his findings, then turned to address me. There is something else, Watson. While examining the scorched lamp in the archive wing, I noticed that the lamp's mechanism had not failed entirely. It had been dampened, the valve twisted partially shut. Someone did not want illumination at the critical moment. To obscure a theft, or to stage an illusion, a vanishing man is quite the feat in low light. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a note, which she handed to Holmes wordlessly. He read it aloud. Mr. Holmes, if you value the stability of your client's establishment, cease your inquiry into Mr. Hollander. Some things are best left misfiled. A friend of the record. Holmes read it twice, then handed it to me. The handwriting, I observed, is smooth, somewhat florid. Female. Holmes nodded. And the ink, French violet, not a standard London brand. And look here, smudged on the loop of the H. The writer was left-handed. What now? Now, Watson, he said, tossing the note into the fire. We revisit Miss Barnum. Not because I believe she wrote the note, but because I believe she knows who did. I said nothing for a moment, watching the violet ink blacken and curl in the hearth. You believe Hollander was taken rather than fled? Holmes nodded. Taken or deceived. Possibly both. But no man vanishes without trace unless someone has first rewritten the script of his departure. That evening, Holmes sent a telegram to Inspector Lestrade, requesting his discreet presence at Clerkenwell the following morning. The inspector's experience with cases of sensitive political undertone, as well as his grudging respect for Holmes's instincts, made him the ideal ally for what Holmes described as a shadow play conducted beneath the flickering gaslight of bureaucracy. As Holmes resumed pacing, fingers pressed together beneath his chin, I couldn't help but feel that this case was pulling us not merely through dusty corridors of a record office, but into a deeper labyrinth entirely, where the past was not only preserved, but dangerously alive. And somewhere, amid ledgers and locks, was a truth someone had sealed with wax and hidden behind paper walls. It was just after 9:30 the next morning when we arrived once again at the Clerkenwell Records office, the sky above a dull pewter sheet and the scent of coal smoke lingering in the air like an old suspicion. Holmes wore his grey ulster coat tightly belted, and his eyes gleamed with that peculiar intensity that signaled his mind had fixed itself on a very specific thread. I had long since learned not to interrupt him during these moments. He had, as he often said, no time for random speculation when the web was already trembling. Inside the reception hall, we found Miss Eliza Barnum directing 2 junior clerks as they loaded document boxes onto a wheeled cart. Her bearing was as composed as before, but when she saw Holmes, her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, as if bracing for a confrontation she had anticipated. "Miss Barnum," Holmes said pleasantly, "I was hoping for a moment of your time. Somewhere private, if you please." She hesitated, clearly weighing her options, then gave a brief nod. "This way." She led us to a narrow reading chamber just off the east corridor, bare save for a pair of leather chairs, a worn mahogany table, and a brass wall sconce that flickered in the draught. "Mr. Holmes," she said as she closed the door behind us, "I gather this is not a casual inquiry." "Indeed, I rarely engage in those," Holmes replied. "I will come directly to the point. We received a note last night, unsigned, unsealed, and suggestive. It advised us to cease our inquiry into Mr. Hollander. The paper bore a scent of heliotrope, the ink a French violet, and the script was executed with a left-handed slant and a distinctive flourish on the capital letters. I do not accuse you of writing it, Miss Barnum, but I do believe you recognize its author." There was a moment's silence. The flickering light cast uneasy shadows across her face, but she did not flinch. "I do," she said finally, "though I hoped it wouldn't come to this." Holmes nodded, unsurprised. "Go on." "The note," she said, folding her hands on the table, "was written by Miss Camilla Valance. She is, or rather was, an occasional researcher granted access to the record office's restricted holdings. An antiquarian, she claimed, specialized in political pamphlets and legal digests from the mid-century. Always polite, always well-dressed, and clearly well-connected. She had letters of recommendation from 3 baronets and a retired judge. Has she visited recently?" "2 weeks ago," Barnum said. "She arrived on a Thursday, spent 4 hours reviewing the sealed parliamentary ledgers. Quentin Hollander was on duty that day." "And what was her rapport with him?" Miss Barnum's expression shifted. "He was unusually attentive. They had long conversations about political history. He even fetched materials outside her request list. I thought little of it at the time. Quentin was a shy man, and Miss Valance had a way of making herself appear deeply interested in her interlocutor's passions. A practiced seduction, Holmes mused, not of the heart, but of the intellect. "Yes," she said softly, "that's exactly it. Have you any idea where she might be found?" Miss Barnum hesitated again, then opened her satchel and removed a slim card. A visiting card, ivory-colored, with delicate gold embossing. Holmes took it, examined the script. Miss Camilla Valance Antiquarian Research and Rare Political Archives, 29 Carver Street, Mayfair. "Do not concern yourself," Holmes said gently, sensing her unease. "You have been most helpful. I will see to it that your name is not drawn into the official report, unless, of course, you choose to include it." "I only want to know what happened to Mr. Hollander," she said, "and I have a feeling you're the only man in London who might uncover it." Holmes gave her the smallest of nods, then gestured for me to follow. As we stepped into the corridor, we found Inspector Lestrade just entering the vestibule, his bowler hat slightly askew and his mustache unbristling from the chill. "Holmes," he said, "you sent for me." "I did indeed, Lestrade." "Walk with me. We're due in Mayfair, and I believe the matter is turning from archival mischief into something altogether more interesting." We took a cab directly to Carver Street. It was a quiet residential lane tucked behind Grosvenor Square, lined with Georgian townhouses bearing the discreet brass plates of solicitors, physicians, and ladies of scholarly inclination. No one answered our knock-at number. 29th. Holmes tried the bell a second time, then crouched to examine the lock and handle. "Not recently used," he murmured. "Dust on the threshold. Yet look." He pointed to a smudge on the frame. "Fresh abrasion. Someone removed the number plate. Recently." Lestrade leaned in. "Trying to disappear?" Holmes nodded. "Successfully for the moment." He turned to a boy sweeping the stoop of the house opposite and flipped him a coin. "Have you seen a lady living at number 29? The boy nodded. "Yes, sir. Black coat, red gloves. Left in a hurry 4 days ago with 2 porters carrying boxes." "Did she say where she was going?" The boy scratched his head. "Heard her tell the cabbie Charing Cross Station. That's all." Holmes's eyes brightened. "A port out of London, perhaps even the country. Come, Lestrade, we must check the station records. But first, Watson, do you recall the missing portfolio from Armitage's ledger, the one not in Hollander's list?" "Oath correspondence. Confidential, yes?" "Precisely. I would wager that Miss Valence was very interested in that collection." Back at Baker Street that evening, Holmes sifted through correspondence and railway notices while I read through a summary of the 1852 Canal Commission scandal, a buried incident involving bribes, diplomatic tensions, and accusations that certain British representatives had used private channels to delay the construction of a Belgian waterway, profiting handsomely from the obstruction. "I see it now," Holmes muttered as he paced. Miss Valence was no simple antiquarian. She was seeking a specific piece of evidence, perhaps letters or oaths implicating current families in old crimes. And Hollander, the perfect mark, timid, brilliant, and flattered by her interest. But what happened to him? "That," Holmes said, pausing, "is the ghost in the archives. Either he discovered her deceit and confronted her, or worse, he aided her under some false promise and became inconvenient." Holmes stepped to the window, his silhouette framed in the gaslight glow, and added darkly, "We must hope, Watson, that Quentin Hollander is still alive, because if he is not, this affair may grow very grave indeed." The street outside was quiet. The fog had returned, curling in thin tendrils over the cobbles, as though the city itself were holding its breath. The following morning broke clear and brittle, a pale sun glinting off the iron rails and damp roofs of London like a promise not yet fulfilled. Holmes was already dressed by the time I emerged from my room at Baker Street, seated at the IG breakfast table with a cup of coffee untouched and his gaze fixed on the fire. His violin lay across the arm of the chair, a single bowstring loosely tightened, as though he'd begun to play and abandoned the thought halfway. "Charing Cross," he said, without turning his head. "It is the pivot, Watson. If our quarry meant to leave the city, it is the likeliest departure point. Even the art of vanishing requires a threshold." We reached the station just past 10. The crowd was already swelling with the usual tide of morning commuters, porters shouting from the platforms, and a foghorn's low bellow from the Thames beyond. Holmes moved with certainty, his long stride avoiding luggage and confusion alike. I followed, notebook in hand. Our first stop was the stationmaster's office, a panelled enclosure just off the central platform, where a broad-shouldered man in a cap and brass buttons looked up as we entered. "Good morning," Holmes said. "I am acting on behalf of Scotland Yard. My colleague and I are investigating the movements of a woman who may have departed from this station 4 days ago. Her name is Camilla Valence." Black traveling coat, red gloves, likely accompanied by 2 porters and several document boxes. The station master's brow furrowed. We don't take names unless they purchase reserved compartments, but 2 porters, you say? That I might recall. He stepped to the counter and opened a ledger, running his finger down a column. A party matching that description boarded the 3:15 train to Dover on Thursday last. Luggage manifest listed 3 cases and 1 leather satchel. Destination, Ostend. Ostend, I repeated. Belgium? Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the flicker of something sharpened in his gaze. The very origin of the 1852 Canal Commission scandal, he murmured. Was there a ticket purchased under her name? No, said the station master. The ticket was bought in cash under the name Miss Cordelia Howard, but I remember her well enough. Strange detail. She insisted on sitting near the back of the carriage, away from windows. Said she suffered from neuralgia. Holmes nodded slowly. May we speak with the porters who assisted her? The station master rang a bell, and within moments a boyish-faced man in his 20s entered, cap in hand. Name's Corbin, sir. Holmes wasted no time. You helped a woman, black coat, red gloves, onto the 3:15 Dover train last Thursday. Yes, sir. I remember. She gave me a whole shilling extra for being careful with the boxes. Were they heavy? One was. Felt like books. The others were lighter, though she told me not to tilt one of them. Said it had a delicate glass case. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Did you see her speak with anyone at the station? Corbin hesitated. Now that you mention it, a man approached her just before boarding, tall, brown, coat, bowler hat. Gave her something, a small envelope. She tucked it into her sleeve. Did you catch his face? No, sir. He kept it turned from me. Looked like he was trying not to be noticed. Did the woman seem surprised or distressed? No, sir. Calm as anything, like she was expecting him. Holmes handed Corbin a coin. Thank you. You've been very helpful. We returned to the station concourse, where the rush of footsteps and the low rattle of trains had taken on a strange hush in my mind. Holmes stood with his arms folded, his brow furrowed in concentration. Belgium, he said at last. If she crossed the channel with stolen documents, she would need protection, contacts, funding. I nodded. Then she must be working for someone. Precisely, and I believe I know who. We returned to Baker Street at once, where Holmes unearthed a thin folder from his personal archives. Watson, he said, spreading its contents on the desk, you remember the case of Baron Duvanel, the Belgian diplomat caught paying off a customs official to smuggle French blueprints through Hull? The very same. Disgraced quietly in 1891, but never fully expelled from diplomatic society. His connections remained intact. Look here. He showed me a photograph, grainy but distinct. Duvanel, a severe man with a widow's peak and a lantern jaw, flanked by 2 younger individuals at a diplomatic gala. The woman at his left, her features unmistakably those of Miss Camilla Valance, was smiling into the camera. Her real name, Holmes said, is likely not Valance at all. And this is no mere academic pursuit. The stolen documents would be invaluable to anyone wishing to destabilize current relations or blackmail figures in Parliament. Then Hollander? Holmes turned grim. Either a dupe or a prisoner. As he spoke, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, holding a sealed envelope on a silver tray. For Mr. Holmes, just delivered. He broke the seal. Inside was a single card with an address scrawled in an elegant, unfamiliar hand. If you want your answers, come alone. St. Bride's Crypt. Tonight. Midnight. No signature. Holmes studied it, then held it up to the light. There, faint but present, was a smudge. Violet ink. Valance, I said. Holmes nodded. Or someone close to her. This is a play for control, Watson. but midnight rendezvous in church crypts rarely end with clean outcomes. He reached for his revolver and slipped it into his coat. "You intend to go?" "I must, and I will go alone, as instructed." "But surely—" "No, Watson. If this is a trap, I must spring it myself. Your task is elsewhere. I need you to visit the Belgian consulate tomorrow. Discreetly inquire whether Baron Duvanel has recently returned from the continent. Mention nothing of Hollander. And if they refuse to speak, then you may assume we're nearer to the heart of this than they'd like us to be." As night fell, I watched Holmes prepare himself, not with anxiety, but with a cold and practiced calm. The man thrived where danger made most others flinch. And yet I saw, in his stillness before the fire, the glimmer of something rare, uncertainty. "If Hollander is alive," he said at last, adjusting his cuffs, "then tonight I may meet the shadow who holds him." And with that, he disappeared into the foggy streets, leaving behind only the scent of pipe tobacco and the whisper of an enigma not yet solved. St. Bride's Church, with its tiered spire and soot-stained facade, stood like a sentinel over Fleet Street, the old stones whispering centuries of secrets to the London fog. By day, it was the haunt of typographers and weary newsmen. By night, it lay quiet and deserted, save for the crypt below, where Holmes had been summoned under the most uncertain of terms. The clock struck 11:45 as Holmes arrived at the wrought-iron gates. The churchyard was empty, the gas lamps casting long shadows across the weathered headstones. A chill wind swept through the courtyard, rustling dead leaves across the path as if ushering him downward. He carried no lantern. Instead, he produced a small electric torch, a compact device of his own design, powered by a pair of coiled cells. The beam cut through the gloom like a scalpel, revealing the narrow entrance to the crypt, a worn wooden door half concealed by ivy and shadow. Holmes stooped, tested the handle. It was unlocked. The hinges moaned softly as he entered. The crypt was a vaulted chamber of stone and silence, damp with centuries of moisture and the faint scent of mildew. Rows of funerary plaques lined the walls, each etched with the names of long-forgotten printers, typesetters, and merchants of the city. Holmes moved slowly, his footsteps muffled by the dust-strewn floor. The only sound was the rhythmic drip of water from the far arch, echoing like the tolling of a distant bell. And then, movement. A figure emerged from the shadows beyond the arch, cloaked and hooded. The torchlight caught the shimmer of silk and the edge of a red glove. "Mr. Holmes?" said a woman's voice, low, composed, and unmistakably that of Camilla Valence. Holmes did not lower the light. "Miss Valence, or should I say Miss Delacroix? That is the name under which you were last recorded traveling from Calais to Antwerp in 1891, is it not?" A pause. "So you have found me out," she said, stepping into clearer view. Her face was pale, ethereal in the half-light, her expression unreadable. "And yet you came. Alone. As requested. I tend to respect well-phrased invitations, particularly when issued by conspirators. Tell me, where is Quentin Hollander?" She tilted her head slightly. "You assume I know." "I know you do. You played upon his academic devotion, lured him with compliments and perhaps even with sympathy, and when he outlived his usefulness, you removed him from sight." Her expression flickered, but she held firm. "He is not dead. Then where is he?" She said nothing, merely turned and beckoned him further into the crypt. Holmes followed cautiously, one hand still on his torch, the other close to his hidden revolver. They passed beneath an archway and descended 3 steps into a smaller chamber, sealed from view by an iron grate. She produced a key from her cloak and turned the lock. Within was a narrow passage, once used by grave diggers, now repurposed. A makeshift bench, a blanket, an oil lantern, and in the corner, disheveled, pale, and blinking against the sudden light, was Quentin Hollander. "Mr. Holmes?" he croaked. Holmes stepped forward but kept his eyes on Camilla. He's alive, but why hide him? Because he refused to leave, she said softly. He discovered what the documents contained, proof of extortion, of names still powerful. I begged him to flee with me, to vanish, take a new name. He refused. He said history deserved to know. Holmes turned to Hollander. Is this true? The young man nodded. She was not dishonest at first. She truly loved the archives. But then I saw her copying files she had no clearance for. I confronted her. She told me everything, about Duvenel, about the commission, about the plan to use the documents for leverage in Brussels. And you decided to stop her? I locked myself in the reading wing that night, but the light failed. Then something struck me. When I woke, I was here. Camilla's voice was laced with remorse. I had no orders to kill him, Mr. Holmes, only to silence him. He's been here since. I brought him food, water, but I knew he would never forgive me. Holmes looked between them. You orchestrated the perfect vanishing act. A sealed building, a blacked-out lamp, a single glove to suggest panic, all elegant touches. Too elegant, in fact. She smiled faintly. A magician's trick, Mr. Holmes, but I fear the audience has grown too wise. He straightened. Where are the documents now? She hesitated, then reached into her cloak and drew out a leather satchel, slightly worn at the edges. The originals are here. Duvenel received copies, partial. I told him it was all I could retrieve, but I held these back. Why? She met his gaze. Because I no longer believe in the cause. Blackmail is not justice, and Hollander's stubborn morality infected me. Holmes took the satchel cautiously. Then you are surrendering? I am resigning from the stage, Mr. Holmes. You may do with me as you see fit. He regarded her for a long moment, then said quietly, Come to Baker Street at noon tomorrow. If you do not arrive, I will give your name to Lestrade. But if you do, perhaps a more civil solution may yet be reached. She said nothing, merely nodded. Holmes turned to Hollander. Are you well enough to walk? I think so. Holmes guided the pale archivist toward the steps. As they ascended, Camilla remained below, a solitary figure among the bones of the past. Outside, the fog had thickened, curling in ghostly spirals around the churchyard. Holmes hailed a cab and helped Hollander inside. Where are we going? He asked faintly. Home, Holmes replied. For now. As we rattled back through the sleeping streets, I studied the satchel on Holmes's lap. It seemed an unremarkable thing, yet inside it lay the secrets of an empire, a truth buried not by time, but by intent. Holmes stared out the window, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. History, Watson, is not a static thing. It is rewritten daily, not just by scholars, but by those who know how to disappear. The morning after the cryptic rendezvous at St. Bride's broke with an uneasy calm. Grey light seeped through the gauze curtains of 221B Baker Street, illuminating a subdued tableau. Quentin Hollander, pale and unshaven, sat hunched in one of our armchairs nursing a cup of strong tea. Holmes stood at the window motionless, one hand resting lightly on the windowsill, the other tucked behind his back, and I sat opposite, watching them both with a growing sense of the moment's weight. The satchel of documents had not been opened since Holmes brought it up from the crypt. It now lay on the desk beside him, silent as a stone. She will come, Holmes said at last, not turning his head. Miss Valence? I asked. She must. A woman who orchestrates a vanishing act and repents mid-performance does not slink off stage quietly. She will want to account for herself, to redeem the role, if only partially. But she is also being watched. Duvenel's men may already know of last night's betrayal. At precisely 12 noon, as promised, the bell rang. Mrs. Hudson answered, and a moment later, Camilla Valence was ushered in. She wore a dark blue cloak. Her gloves were gone, and the air of theatrical poise had faded. There was weariness in her eyes. Genuine now, not the well-rehearsed expression of the seductive antiquarian. "You kept your word," Holmes said simply. "I always intended to," she replied, casting a glance toward Hollander, whose face revealed a complex flurry of emotion, resentment, relief, and something resembling pity. Holmes motioned to the satchel. "These documents, have they been copied in full?" "No," she said. "I made extracts for Duvanel, yes. He believes he has what he needs. But the incriminating pieces remain here." "Then the leverage is intact," Holmes said, satisfied. "And now the question becomes, what to do with it?" At that moment, a loud rap sounded at the door below. 3 heavy knocks. Holmes stiffened. "Expecting someone?" I asked. "No," he said flatly. "Watson, see who it is." Carefully. I descended to the entry and opened the door to find Inspector Lestrade, flanked by 2 plainclothes officers. "Morning, Doctor," Lestrade said grimly. "We need a word with Mr. Holmes." Back upstairs, Holmes met Lestrade at the threshold, not surprised. "What is it?" "There's been an incident at the Palace of Westminster," Lestrade said, removing his gloves. "A man was found unconscious in the strangers' gallery. Foreign accent, no identification, but carrying a note addressed to one Camilla Valence." Camilla's eyes widened. "Was he armed?" Holmes asked. "Number, but he had sketches, maps of the Parliament layout. Some sort of surveillance. The note's contents were brief. You have one chance to deliver the real documents, noon, or there will be noise among the lords they cannot ignore." Holmes whistled low. A bluff. Duvanel's desperation. Lestrade turned to Camilla. "Do you know this man?" She nodded slowly. "Carroll, Duvanel's courier. I didn't know he had followed me this far." Lestrade crossed his arms. "And what exactly have you involved yourself in, Miss Valence?" "I attempted to bring the truth to light," she said quietly. "But I became tangled in the methods. I was meant to retrieve and deliver the evidence, but I began to see what damage Duvanel intended to cause. I chose to stop." Holmes interjected, "Lestrade, if I may offer a recommendation, Miss Valence has surrendered the original documents. The man in Parliament was not acting independently. He's a tool. Let her cooperate, and she can lead you directly to Duvanel's network." Lestrade hesitated. "Cooperate? How?" Holmes walked to the satchel and tapped its side. "Let her deliver it. A controlled drop. You place men at the location. We feed them only partial truths, and when Duvanel makes his move, we close the net." Lestrade considered. "A dangerous game." "The only one Duvanel understands," Holmes replied. After a tense silence, Lestrade relented. "Very well, but I'll be watching." Holmes spent the next hour carefully curating the contents of the satchel. With Camilla's help, he selected only a portion of the material, the more mundane entries, the misleading correspondence, and replaced the rest with weighted parchment. "Duvanel must believe it's all here," he said, "and he must move swiftly. Desperation breeds recklessness." By 4 that afternoon, a meeting point was arranged. A small alcove beneath the Thames embankment near Cleopatra's Needle, often used for deliveries by river. The satchel would be left there. Camilla would appear alone, wait 15 minutes, then depart. Holmes and Lestrade, with officers posted along every vantage point, would watch and wait. As the hour approached, Holmes grew quieter. He studied the wind, the way the fog curled beneath the bridges, and even the patter of feet along the embankment stones. "She's in real danger," I said at last. He didn't respond for several seconds. "She's already in it," he said. "The difference is whether we pull her out before the tide turns." At precisely 5 minutes past the hour, Camilla approached the alcove. She carried the satchel calmly, her steps unhurried. Holmes and I observed from a shadowed niche atop the embankment steps, Lestrade watching from the adjacent arch. She placed the satchel on the ground, straightened, and took 3 steps back. The water lapped gently below. A barge passed in the distance. Then, movement. A man in a grey coat emerged from a side stair, his pace cautious but assured. He approached the satchel, stooped, and lifted it without checking its contents. His face, square-jawed, mustached, and bearing the rigid composure of an ex-military man, was instantly recognizable to Holmes. "Not Duvanel," he muttered, "but someone close." A signal from Lestrade, and the officers moved. The man bolted, but found every escape blocked. He turned, saw the futility, and dropped the satchel with a grunt of defeat. "Name?" Lestrade barked as he approached. The man hesitated, then muttered, "Etienne Robard, attaché to Baron Duvanel." "Not anymore," Lestrade said. The arrest was swift. As Robard was led away, Camilla stepped forward, staring at the satchel on the cobblestones as if it had aged her in its journey. Holmes retrieved it and turned to her. "You've done what few could," he said. "You walked away." She nodded faintly. "Only just." That night, back at Baker Street, Holmes reviewed the seized correspondence recovered from Robard's person. Among it, a telegram sent 3 days prior. "Make final move. Retrieve full archive. Silence Hollander if necessary. Britain's sins will pay for our silence. D." Holmes exhaled slowly. "Watson," he said, "we are not dealing merely with theft or espionage. This is something more corrosive. Blackmail masquerading as patriotism. It eats at the bones of empire." I leaned forward. "And what now?" "Now we follow the scent to the source," he said, "for Duvanel is no longer hiding in shadows. He is watching from the gallery. The question is, does he know we see him?" It was 2 days after the incident beneath Cleopatra's Needle that Holmes declared, without ceremony, "It ends tonight." The documents secured, the courier detained, and Miss Valence safely under discreet police supervision, yet Baron Duvanel remained at large, an elusive spectre hovering just beyond reach. The net had tightened around him, but Holmes had not yet located the place from which the Baron pulled his strings. Until that morning. "I've often told you, Watson," Holmes remarked over his black coffee, "that criminals, even the cleverest, are creatures of habit. Duvanel is no different. When under pressure, the fox returns to its earth. In his case, that earth is diplomatic. You believe he's sheltering at the Belgian legation? Not precisely. The legation is watched, and he is too cunning to expose himself in plain sight. But there exists a satellite property, a manor leased to the Belgian delegation in Highgate, ostensibly for quiet retreats and private gatherings. A retreat for diplomacy or secrecy. How did you come across this information?" Holmes tapped the morning edition of the Times. A single paragraph in the society column. "An intimate gathering hosted by the Belgian minister took place this past Sunday in Highgate Park, including members of 3 European embassies, 2 titled guests, and 1 unnamed antiquarian of remarkable poise. Our Miss Valence, I suspect, though uncredited. Then we act?" Holmes stood and buckled his coat. "We act, but not alone." By noon, Inspector Lestrade joined us at Scotland Yard, already apprised of the Highgate address. "We've had men watching Duvanel's likely routes, but he's kept out of sight. If he's there tonight, we'll need to move quietly, and quickly." Holmes requested only a small team, 4 men, experienced and ununiformed. "Too many, and he'll smell it," he warned. "He survived political disgrace once. He won't allow it to happen again." The plan was simple in its architecture and dangerous in its execution. Holmes would accompany Lestrade and the yard men to the Highgate Manor under the pretense of serving diplomatic correspondence. If Duvanel was inside, Holmes would speak with him directly, to provoke, to unbalance. Lestrade and his men would wait just out of sight, poised to arrest the Baron should he attempt flight or destruction of evidence. As dusk fell, the sky over Highgate turned a cold lavender, the trees' sharp silhouettes against the deepening dark. The manor itself was a stately, ivy-covered edifice nestled behind iron gates and an overgrown hedge. Holmes and Lestrade approached the front entrance on foot, leaving the cab behind. I remained behind in a secondary position, watching from the tree line, revolver in my coat pocket, a precaution Holmes had insisted upon. The butler, clearly not English, opened the door with a guarded expression. Holmes, ever the chameleon, produced a letter bearing the seal of the Foreign Office, crafted that afternoon under Lestrade's guidance, and offered it with quiet formality. It concerns a matter of diplomatic urgency. The man hesitated, then ushered them into a lavish drawing room. Rich Persian carpets, carved oak paneling, and gas lamps that glowed too brightly for comfort. On the far wall hung a painting of a canal scene in Bruges, its waters stagnant, its boats empty. And there he was, Baron Duvanel. He stood by the hearth, tall and thin, with silver-threaded hair and the air of one who had grown too used to whispers. His eyes, pale and hawk-like, settled on Holmes with the faintest twitch of recognition. "Mr. Holmes," he said in fluent, accented English. I wondered when the shadow would take form. "Baron Duvanel," Holmes replied. "The honor is yours." A small smile. "And you bring with you the emissaries of justice?" "Not quite yet," Holmes said. "First, I come to understand you, a man of diplomacy turned saboteur, an antiquarian of sorts, who buries blackmail beneath parchment and calls it restoration." Duvanel's smile deepened, but his eyes darkened. "You overestimate me. I am but a collector of truths." "Truths twisted into leverage," Holmes replied. "The correspondence you sought to extract, the bribes, the signatures, they would have unseated half the lords if you'd wielded them. And what then? A quiet revolution or a lucrative arrangement for you? You think so small, Mr. Holmes. Britain has profited from forgetting its sins. I merely remind." "Not out of principle," Holmes said, voice cold. "Out of profit. And convenience." A pause. The fire crackled in the hearth. Holmes stepped forward. "We have the originals. Your man Robard failed. Valence turned. Your courier was arrested in Parliament. This performance, Baron, is over." Duvanel's fingers twitched at his side. A tick, a tremor. Then suddenly he turned. Not to flee, but to the desk behind him. Holmes lunged instantly, catching his wrist as a small pistol slipped from the Baron's palm. Lestrade and his men rushed in at the sound of the scuffle, pinning Duvanel before the gun hit the floor. "You are under arrest," Lestrade declared, "for conspiracy, blackmail, and unlawful possession of state documents." Duvanel said nothing. His expression was calm, even resigned. But as he was led from the manor in cuffs, Holmes noticed something odd. On the edge of the Baron's sleeve, ink, fresh, violet. Back at Baker Street, later that night, Holmes laid out all the elements with surgical clarity. The documents had been preserved. Miss Valence had signed a full statement. Robard's courier testimony corroborated the link to Duvanel. The Belgian authorities, desperate to avoid scandal, were quietly cooperating. Yet Holmes did not look satisfied. "You've caught him," I said. "What troubles you?" Holmes tapped his fingers against his teacup. "There is a final shadow, Watson. One more name, the man in Whitehall who first commissioned Duvanel's inquiries. Someone gave him access to the 1852 materials. Someone high." "Armitage?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. Number Armitage was a functionary. He followed rules, and he was easy to deceive. But someone wanted those documents seen. Someone who hoped they would disappear or reappear at the right time. "Who?" "I don't yet know, but I have a suspicion. There is a man, seen recently in the Parliament gallery, unlisted, known only to a few ministers as an advisor on foreign archives. I intend to learn his name." He stood, lit his pipe, and stared into the fire. "This case is ending, but the echo of it will not fade so easily. Truth, when buried too long, tends to claw its way upward, hungry and sharp." And for a long while, neither of us spoke. The house was quiet. Outside, London breathed its damp breath upon the glass, and somewhere beyond the gas lamps, a name waited to be found. It was on the second morning following Baron Duvanel's arrest that Holmes resumed his restless pacing before the fire, a familiar habit that, to the untrained eye, might suggest frustration or indecision. But I had seen this before. It was not uncertainty that walked with Holmes in such moments, but an intense internal dialogue, a duel between logic and intuition, between the evidence already gathered and the shadow it had yet to outline. Duvanel's fall had rippled swiftly through diplomatic circles. The Belgian legation, eager to disavow him, had offered every assistance to Scotland Yard. Robart's testimony was already being transcribed into official indictments. The documents had been sealed and transferred into secure government custody. Even Miss Camilla Valance, after providing a full statement and expressing an almost startling willingness to testify, had been placed in protective watch. And yet Holmes was unsettled. "There is a flaw in the tapestry, Watson," he said that morning, his voice low, measured. "A missing thread that, once tugged, will unravel the entire cloth." He turned sharply to the stack of notes spread across his desk. "Consider the chain of access. Valance entered the record office under the pretense of academic research with references from individuals of significant social standing. Too significant. A judge, 3 baronets, a member of the Privy Council, all tied in some indirect way to trade committees in the early 1850s. And who manages such references for access to embargoed government material? "The Archive Board," I said, catching his drift. "Precisely. And at the head of that board is Sir Almeric Templeton." I frowned. "Templeton, the historian?" Holmes nodded. "A revered scholar, wrote a treatise on the ethics of political memory. Serves as a confidential advisor to several departments, including the Foreign Office. Officially neutral. Unofficially, he has his fingers in every drawer that holds secrets." "And you believe he permitted Valance to enter?" "More than that. I believe he orchestrated it, not for profit, but for control." Holmes retrieved a slim dossier from his cabinet and handed it to me. Inside were several press clippings and annotations, all centered on Sir Almeric Templeton. Lectures delivered, positions held, committees chaired. All unremarkable, until Holmes tapped a specific entry. "See her," he said. "2 years ago, Templeton delivered a closed-door session to the Ministry of Defense. Subject, historical leverage in modern diplomacy. A curious phrase, don't you think?" I nodded slowly. "You believe he planned to weaponize the past? To keep Britain's position intact as old allies shift and foreign interests encroach? Duvanel was merely a tool. Valance, an unwitting pawn turned defector. Templeton stands behind the curtain, shaping the theater." Holmes crossed to the fireplace, relit his pipe, and watched the smoke curl upward like the slow rising of a truth long buried. "There is a pattern, Watson. The original scandal of 1852, the canal obstruction, was more than corruption. It was strategy. Britain delayed Belgian expansion not merely for profit, but to preserve dominance over maritime routes. If that documentation had surfaced unchecked, not only would reputations fall, but so would trust between modern allies." He paced again, slower now. But Templeton erred in one point. He trusted that no one would examine the ledger trail, that no one would trace the false references. I stood. "Then we must confront him." Holmes smiled thinly. "He will not be easily rattled. Men like Templeton surround themselves with plausible deniability, but if we press precisely the right nerve—" He reached for his coat. Come, Watson, we shall pay a visit to the British Museum. Not for antiquities, but for the keeper of our modern relics. The manuscript reading room of the British Museum, domed, hushed, and perfumed with the musk of aging paper, was the perfect setting for Sir Almeric Templeton. We found him seated at a long oak table beneath a shaft of glass-filtered light, pen in hand, scribbling upon a note card with meticulous attention. He looked up as Holmes approached and smiled, a genial expression that masked an intellect sharper than most razors. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "and Dr. Watson, if I'm not mistaken." "A pleasure." Holmes offered no greeting. "I trust you've heard of Baron Duvanel's arrest." Templeton laid down his pen and folded his hands. "Yes, most unfortunate. Diplomatic scandals never serve the common good." "And yet," Holmes replied, "this one has been most enlightening. It has shown us how threads thought lost in time may be pulled into the present by those with an eye for power." Templeton's smile did not falter. "A poetic notion." Holmes drew a paper from his coat, a copy of Valance's request letter bearing Templeton's recommendation. He placed it gently before the man. "You vouched for her." Templeton did not even look at the paper. "I provide letters for many scholars. Miss Valance was introduced through Lord Trevanion, who died 6 months prior to that signature." Holmes interrupted. A pause. Templeton's eyes narrowed slightly. "You went to great lengths," Holmes continued, "to ensure Valance had access to those archives, because you hoped she would act as a siphon, someone whose loyalty could be bought or compelled, but she surprised you. She grew a conscience. Now Duvanel is in custody. Robard is naming names, and the ledger you manipulated." He tapped the paper once more. "As a missing entry in your own hand." Templeton exhaled slowly. "What is it you seek, Mr. Holmes? Public disgrace? Trial? I'm an old man. History will outlive me." "Perhaps," Holmes said, "but justice is not measured in time, only in clarity." Templeton rose, adjusting his coat. "Then you have clarity. Do what you must." As he walked away, the silence of the reading room seemed suddenly oppressive. Holmes watched him go, then turned to me with a look not of triumph, but of restraint. "We have the name now, Watson, the puppeteer. But justice will not come in the courtroom. Not for Templeton. He will fade, resign, retreat into private life, his disgrace unspoken. That is the price of maintaining the illusion of stability." I nodded grimly. "Is that enough?" Holmes considered the question, then quietly, "It must be. Sometimes the truth must be seen, not shouted." That evening, back at Baker Street, we received word that Sir Almeric Templeton had resigned from the archive board, citing declining health. A quiet end to a loud shadow. Hollander, recovered and steady, had returned to his post under new security protocols. Camilla Valance, her statement complete, was to be sent abroad under a new name. And the original documents, those that had sparked the fire, were returned to the Home Office under lock and seal. As Holmes lit his pipe and stared into the flickering firelight, he offered one final reflection. "There are cases, Watson, where we grasp not only the criminal, but the architecture that enables him. When that happens, our task is not to raise the building, but to weaken the foundation, so that truth may rise where secrecy once stood." And so ended the case of the vanishing archivist, an affair not merely of disappearance, but of what is made to disappear, and who profits from the vanishing. It was a mild winter afternoon, several weeks after the quiet resignation of Sir Almeric Templeton, when I found myself once again seated in the familiar sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The city outside had begun to shed its veil of early frost, and a brittle sun filtered through the soot-specked panes, bathing Holmes's cluttered desk in a pale light. In the grate, the fire had been reduced to a lazy red glow, and Holmes, sprawled languidly in the armchair, seemed, at first glance, to be in a state of complete repose. But I had known him long enough to recognize the illusion. His fingers rested upon the armrest not in idleness, but in deliberate stillness. His gaze, unfixed, stared through the curling smoke of his pipe as if searching some invisible thread in the ether. Even the way he exhaled, a subtle hiss through clenched teeth, spoke not of rest, but reflection. He had refused, despite pressure from both Lestrade and certain members of the Foreign Office, to publish his conclusions on the Templeton matter. No name had been placed before a magistrate, no charges filed, no public reckoning. And this, perhaps more than anything else in our years together, left Holmes with a sour note of dissatisfaction. "You must understand, Watson," he said at last, "there are truths that, if aired, rot faster in sunlight. Templeton's designs, though insidious, were cloaked in the garments of patriotism. To expose him would do little more than fray the seams of that cloak without mending the heart underneath." I offered no challenge. In truth, I understood. The affair had proven that some ghosts do not vanish when unmasked. They only haunt quieter halls. Still, there were victories. Quentin Hollander had returned to the Royal Historical Records Office under new leadership. Mr. Percival Armitage, after submitting a letter of resignation penned with equal parts shame and relief, had departed for a quieter life in Devonshire. Miss Eliza Barnum was promoted to Deputy Archivist. Holmes had spoken highly of her competence, and I had since heard that her efforts had transformed the record-keeping systems into a model of clarity. As for Miss Camilla Valence, she had vanished into Europe under a name I was never told. Holmes had handed her a sealed envelope before she left, its contents unknown to me, and though I dared not ask, I sometimes caught him glancing toward the hearth, as if remembering the ghost of a woman who had walked too close to the fire and survived it only just. Holmes rose from his chair, stretched, and crossed to his desk. There, amidst an arrangement of clippings, wax samples, and handwritten notations, he drew out a folded sheet of notepaper. "I received this 3 days ago," he said, passing it to me. The paper bore the crisp watermark of a Belgian stationery firm. The handwriting was neat, fluid, and unmistakably female. "Mr. Holmes, I am safe. I do not seek redemption, but I offer thanks. Whatever darkness I aided, you ensured it did not thrive. I keep the letter you gave me in my coat, unread. One day I may be brave enough to open it. Until then, may your pursuit of truth remain unclouded. C." I handed the letter back in silence. Holmes placed it in the small drawer where he kept other unspoken things. Photographs of Irene Adler, a note from Mycroft once signed, "Your inferior," and, curiously, a faded piece of stained wax he'd never explained. "And Hollander?" I asked. "He has resumed his work with vigor," Holmes replied, "though he has taken to locking his chamber door at dusk and refuses to discuss anything related to diplomatic collections. The man has seen behind the curtain and found the world behind it colder than expected." There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson, bearing a telegram. Holmes accepted it, read it, and raised one eyebrow. "It appears our friend Lestrade has need of us. A burglary at a Kensington townhouse. The victim, a foreign diplomat. The only item stolen, a portfolio of handwritten letters from the 1830s. The matter, he says, has a distinctly Holmesian odor." He retrieved his coat and cane. "Coming, Watson?" I stood. "You never rest, do you?" "Rest is a condition for the weary. I, on the other hand, am merely unburdened. For now." As we stepped into the crisp afternoon air, I found myself glancing back at the window of 221B, the curtain fluttering slightly as though stirred by something unseen. A trace of ink, a whisper of wax, the echo of secrets barely sealed. And as we climbed into the cab, Holmes turned to me with that slight curl of the lip that always marked the start of a new chase. "This last case," he said, "was not about theft or even disappearance. It was about memory, Watson. What we choose to preserve, what we are forced to forget. And what of justice? I asked. He exhaled slowly, watching the London streets blur past. Justice, my dear fellow, is merely the final name we give to a truth that has survived the telling. And with that, we rode on toward Kensington, the wind stirring the city's smoke and secrets behind us, while ahead another mystery waited, as they always did. It was not more than a fortnight after our departure for the Kensington case that a peculiar undercurrent began to ripple once again through London's bureaucratic strata. A low murmur that began in drawing rooms of cautious conversation filtered into tea-house whispers and eventually brushed its fingers once more across the threshold of 221B Baker Street. Holmes, who had treated the Kensington burglary with only passing intrigue, now turned his attention back to the faint traces left in the wake of Templeton's quiet fall. It began with a single phrase, a curious addendum in a letter forwarded to Holmes from a retired civil servant who had once worked with Sir Almeric Templeton on a boundary commission for the Sudan. One must marvel at the timing of Sir Templeton's illness, just as the Foreign Office finds itself urgently recalling documents from the East Africa Agreement of '54, documents that, as I recall, were last reviewed by one Mr. Quintus Hollander under Templeton's own instruction. Holmes read the letter twice, folded it neatly, and placed it on the mantel. He did not speak for nearly 5 minutes, but I could feel the shift in the room. The coals of the previous case, not extinguished but merely sleeping, now began to glow once more. "What is it?" I finally asked. Holmes turned, his voice low and measured. "The archivist may not have vanished only once, Watson." He paced to the desk, opened his black leather-bound notebook, and began turning pages at speed until he stopped at a name I hadn't heard in weeks. The East Africa Agreement, Port Harcourt Addendum, 1854. Embargoed. I dismissed this initially as a coincidence. Templeton had a habit of keeping archival work beneath layers of diplomatic dust, but it seems he planted more seeds than we realized. I stood and stepped closer. "You believe another set of documents was being prepared for misuse?" Holmes nodded. "And what's more, he may not have been working alone. Look here, this note from Valence's sealed statement, a passage we overlooked in the rush of Duvanel's capture." He handed me the excerpt. "On the 4th evening of my work in the manuscript wing, Mr. Hollander expressed concern that a second portfolio had gone missing. He believed it had been withdrawn without authorization. I urged him to let it go. He refused. I read it twice, my pulse quickening. You think he uncovered something else? Something even Valence didn't fully comprehend?" Holmes nodded. "And he may have attempted to record or flag it through back channels, which would explain this second communication I received yesterday." He handed me a small envelope, faintly water-stained, without seal or sender. Inside was a note, typewritten, unsigned. "The archivist has seen more than one ledger, Mr. Holmes. He left you a clue. Look beneath the third index plate of the 1852 folio. What Templeton buried there was not meant for daylight." I looked up at Holmes sharply. "Who sent this?" "No idea," he replied. "But the typeface is from a Royal Clerk's Remington Model 5, only recently distributed to a handful of offices in Whitehall. Whoever wrote it is on the inside and fears reprisal." That same afternoon we departed again for Clerkenwell. The Royal Historical Records Office, now under Miss Eliza Barnum's measured leadership, had been reorganized with startling efficiency. We were admitted with little delay, though Miss Barnum eyed the envelope in Holmes's hand with a look of cautious anticipation. "You're returning to the folio collection," she said as she led us into the main wing. "Is this about Hollander again?" "In part," Holmes replied, "but more about what he may have failed to reveal." She said no more, merely unlocked the archive wing and withdrew to her office with the tact and wisdom of one who knew her presence might disturb more than it might assist. Holmes found the 1852 folio volume swiftly, handling the weathered binder with reverence. He flipped past the embossed spine label and removed the third index plate. Beneath it, hidden in a narrow recess between the leather lining and the board, was a slip of thin parchment. Aged, foxed, but intact. He extracted it with tweezers and laid it gently on the reading table, beneath a glass weight. It was a memorandum, unsigned, undated, but unmistakably of Foreign Office origin. Additional revisions to the Port Harcourt Addendum are to be undertaken under silent clause. Language to obscure naval presence along the Cross River. Ministerial approval unnecessary if distribution is internal. Should record be audited, reference document is to be suppressed under Standard Black Portfolio Classification. A.T. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Naval redirection, he said. In the 1850s, this would have meant hundreds of miles of protected trade redirected to British ports without parliamentary oversight. In other words, I said slowly, a cover-up of colonial manipulation. Holmes nodded. And the trail leads back to Templeton once more. But how was Hollander involved? He must have discovered this document before his initial disappearance. Perhaps it was what first caught his attention, the reason he began suspecting irregularities. It would explain the subtle panic Armitage described. Hollander wasn't merely cataloguing. He was trying to protect the historical record from political laundering. Holmes packed the document carefully and turned to me with fresh resolve. Templeton may be retired, but this reaches beyond him. The memorandum confirms systemic concealment. Someone within the current Foreign Office still benefits from these shadows. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes penned a formal but discreet letter to Sir Reginald Mallory, a senior clerk in the Foreign Office known for his integrity. He is one of the few remaining gatekeepers of conscience, Holmes explained. He may ensure this memorandum is treated with the scrutiny it demands, but if he is silenced or removed, then we shall have confirmation that the ledger has merely passed to new hands. I sat in silence, watching Holmes seal the envelope with dark wax. The flames danced in the grate behind him, casting strange shadows across his angular features. So it continues, I said. Even after Templeton's fall? Holmes looked up, his gaze far away. Yes, Watson, because the Archivist did not vanish in vain. He left a map, hidden between pages and policy, and though his voice may tremble, it has not yet faded. As the evening wore on, the fire burned low and the city beyond our window softened into mist and silence. The great machine of empire turned on, heedless and slow. But in our small corner of Baker Street, we had once more uncovered the truth, not just of men, but of memory. A truth that, once seen, cannot be unseen. And so, even in the embers of a case we believed concluded, the fire glowed anew. 3 nights passed after Holmes dispatched the memorandum to Sir Reginald Mallory, each one wrapped in a quiet tension that only grew heavier with the passage of time. There are moments in Holmes's life when action is his oxygen, when the waiting is not a pause but a slow suffocation. This was one of them. He paced like a wolf in a cage, rejecting the violin, ignoring the Morning Post, and leaving his breakfast untouched each day. I attempted conversation on several occasions, but he answered only in monosyllables. His thoughts were not with me, nor with the room, but back within the dust-cloaked margins of that parchment, within the ink that linked a dying empire's manipulation to the silence of archivists and the machinations of old men. It was on the 4th evening that the silence broke. At precisely 7:23 p.m., a messenger arrived at Baker Street bearing a sealed note of the Foreign Office. Holmes tore it open without ceremony and read it 3 times, his eyes narrowing at each pass. Then, without a word, he handed it to me. The note was short. Mr. Holmes, your concerns regarding the Port Harcourt memorandum have been reviewed in confidence. You are correct. Its contents are authentic and troubling. The Foreign Secretary has ordered an internal audit, beginning immediately. The document has been removed from public access and sealed in the Royal Record Vault under executive order. Discretion is imperative. R. Mallory. Executive order, Holmes muttered, crossing to the hearth. They have buried it again, Watson. Yes, I said slowly. But at least it's buried knowingly now. Not beneath layers of forgotten ink and misfiled folios, but where eyes may watch it, even if silently. Holmes said nothing. He leaned one hand on the mantel and stared into the fire as though waiting for the flames to spit back an answer. When he did speak, it was almost to himself. They will not destroy it. That much is clear. Some records, no matter how damning, become too dangerous to burn. They are kept like loaded pistols, hidden but close. I considered this in silence for a moment, then asked, "And what of Hollander? Does he know?" "He will," Holmes replied. "In time. But I do not believe he is ready. The poor fellow walks like a man who's stepped out of a tomb and is afraid to see sunlight. He still visits the record office in the early hours. Alone, mostly. I've watched him. He lingers near the parliamentary folios, though he no longer touches them. And Valence." Holmes allowed himself a rare smile. "Vanished again, this time of her own accord, I suspect. Lestrade said she slipped through France 3 days after her statement was signed. The name she used at the ferry crossing was Estelle Moorcroft, a literary flourish, perhaps." A beat passed. Then he added, "I gave her the address of a monastery archive near Geneva. They value discretion and have a fondness for ink-stained scholars. Perhaps she'll find peace among records that seek only truth, not leverage." I glanced toward the bookshelf, where a small framed clipping had been recently added. It was a column from the Times, unsigned, but clearly written by a sympathetic insider. In a system where documents are power and ink is currency, it is not always those with titles who safeguard the future. Sometimes it is the quiet ones, buried among ledgers, who guard the soul of a nation. Below it, in a pen Holmes did not often use, were the initials Q.H. Later that week, a formal summons arrived from the Home Office. They had read Holmes's analysis, reviewed Valence's testimony, and concluded that while no public case would be made against Sir Elmerick Templeton, his archives and private correspondences were to be inventoried under direct supervision. Holmes declined their offer to assist. "I have no desire to catalogue the skeletons of a man already buried in legacy," he said. "Let them exhume what they dare." Instead, Holmes and I paid a final visit to Clerkenwell, this time unannounced. The archives were still and solemn, as though the walls themselves understood that a chapter had closed within them. Miss Eliza Barnum met us in the entry hall and led us, without words, into the main reading room. It was there we found Hollander. He was seated beneath a shaft of light from the high clear-story windows, a folio spread open before him, not from the 1850s, but an unremarkable set of 1847 agricultural records. Still, he was not reading. He looked up as we approached, blinking as though seeing ghosts. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." We sat with him, and for some time, nothing was said. Finally, Holmes broke the silence. "You left something beneath the index plate. You knew it would be found eventually." Hollander's hands trembled slightly on the table's edge. "I was afraid, not just of them, but of what it meant if I did nothing." "You did more than most," Holmes said, "more than many would dare." The young man met his gaze. "Was it worth it?" Holmes considered that question with the care he reserved only for the gravest of matters. "Justice," he said at last, "did not come in headlines or trials. But it stirred. It shook the dust. And now, those who would manipulate memory must think twice. That is not a small victory." Hollander nodded once. His eyes brimmed but did not spill. We left him there, among the shelves, his shadow cast long by the afternoon sun, a figure not of tragedy, but of fragile triumph. As we walked down Middleton Street, Holmes placed his hands behind his back, his coat fluttering slightly in the breeze. "There's an old proverb," he said, "that ink is the blood of civilization. But perhaps it is something else entirely. Perhaps it is the conscience, quiet, unyielding, and terribly hard to erase." Back at Baker Street that evening, he returned to his violin. The strains that emerged were neither melancholy nor celebratory, but steady, measured, like the careful lines of a clerk's script, notes that spoke not of finality, but of careful preservation. Outside, London breathed as it always had. The fog crept through the alleys, the newsboys shouted, the lamps flickered. But somewhere beneath the city, in archives, in drawers, in sealed boxes behind iron gates, there lay a ledger that could not burn, a record kept, a truth endured, a name remembered.